The crystalline spires of Zephyros Prime hummed with panic. Across the three worlds of the Zephirian Confederation, beings of living crystal pressed together in their great halls, their bodies ringing with frequencies of terror that had not been heard in 1,000 generations. High Resonator Kithara stood at the center of the grand chamber, her translucent form flickering between deep blue and angry red as the distress signals from the outer system reached them. The harmonic reports were clear and terrible. The Ravager horde had arrived. How many ships? Asked Second Resonator Velox, his crystalline voice cracking with stress. The scouts counted over 2,000 vessels before they were destroyed, Kithara replied. Her form dimmed with grief. The entire outer defense grid is gone. We have perhaps 6 planetary cycles before they reach Zephyros Prime. The chamber filled with discordant notes of despair. The Zephirians had known peace for millennia. Their weapons were ceremonial, their military nothing more than a peaceful patrol force. They were scholars, artists, and philosophers who had spent their existence creating beauty and sharing knowledge with any species, willing to trade ideas for their precious quantum crystals. Now death was coming for them in the form of the most feared force in the galaxy. The Ravager horde was a nightmare that traveled between stars. They were not a species, but a collective of cybernetic beings who had long ago abandoned their original forms. They existed only to consume, to strip entire worlds of every useful resource before moving on to the next target. Worlds that resisted were burned clean. Worlds that surrendered were harvested more slowly, but the end result was always the same. We must send the call, Kithara said, her voice carrying the weight of desperation. Alert every civilization in our communication range. Offer them everything we have in exchange for military aid. Velox's form flickered with doubt. High Resonator, our quantum crystal reserves represent 10,000 years of accumulated wealth. Our harmonic libraries contain the music of creation itself. Are we truly willing to give away our entire civilization's treasure? Kithara's response rang through the chamber with perfect clarity. What good are treasures if we are all dead? Send the call. Offer them anything they want. The crystals, the music, our research on dimensional resonance, our maps of the quantum tunnels. Everything. The great transmitters of Zephyros Prime awakened for the first time in centuries. Massive crystalline arrays that normally sang gentle songs to the stars now screamed desperate pleas across the galaxy. The message was simple, translated into hundreds of languages and broadcast on every known frequency. This is the Zephirian Confederation. We face extinction. The Ravager horde approaches our worlds with overwhelming force. We have no military capable of resisting them. We offer our complete accumulated wealth, knowledge, and sacred harmonies to any species willing to provide military assistance. Our quantum crystal reserves, our harmonic libraries, our dimensional research. Everything we have built in 10 millennia of civilization. Please help us. Time is running out. The response from the galaxy's great powers came swiftly. The Altarian Empire, masters of 100 star systems, sent their regrets. Their border wars with the hegemony required all available forces. They could offer the Zephirians refuge in their outer colonies, but no military support. The Centauri Federation expressed deep sympathy, but explained that their non-aggression treaties prevented direct intervention in conflicts beyond their sphere of influence. They too offered to accept refugees. The ancient vegan Dominion, eldest of the galaxy's civilizations, did not even respond to the plea. The Corvin Trade Alliance sent a brief message explaining that while they valued their commercial relationship with the Zephirians, they could not risk their merchant fleets against the Ravager horde. One by one, every major power in the galaxy found reasons to turn away. Some offered sympathy. Others suggested diplomatic solutions that everyone knew the Ravagers would ignore. A few proposed refugee programs that would save perhaps 1% of the Zephirian population. None offered to fight. As the second day passed without meaningful response, despair settled over the Zephirian worlds like a toxic cloud. Parents held their young close, their crystalline forms singing soft lullabies that might be the last songs their children would ever hear. Artists worked frantically to preserve their greatest works in quantum storage, hoping that some fragment of their culture might survive even if their people did not. Kithara stood in her private chamber, watching the stars through the crystal walls. Somewhere out there, the Ravager horde was approaching and the galaxy's great civilizations were turning their backs. She had lived for 800 years. had seen her people grow and prosper, had believed that the universe was fundamentally good and that civilization meant something. Now she wondered if they had been naive fools, building their crystal cities while surrounded by predators who saw compassion as weakness. A soft chime drew her attention. Another response to their distress call was coming in. Probably another polite refusal, another expression of regret from a species that valued its own safety more than justice. But this message was different. It came from a star system that most galactic databases listed as barely worth noting, a small yellow star on the outer rim, orbited by several worlds, including one that had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. Most civilizations barely remembered they existed. The message was brief, transmitted in heavily accented galactic standard that suggested the speakers were still learning the language. But the words hit Kythera like a shockwave. Message received. We understand your situation. The Terran Federation will provide military assistance. Help is coming. Hold on. Kythera stared at the communication display, hardly believing what she was reading. Humans? The primitive species that had barely joined galactic civilization? They had achieved space travel only decades ago, possessed technology that was considered outdated by galactic standards, and commanded a military force so small that most powers ignored them entirely. She quickly accessed the galactic database, searching for information about these humans. What she found was not encouraging. Earth was a backwater world. Their largest ships were smaller than Zephirian civilian transports. Their weapons technology was based on crude chemical propulsion and primitive energy systems. According to every military analysis, they posed no threat to any established power, but they had responded. When every great civilization in the galaxy had turned away, these humans had offered to fight. Kythera activated the chamber's communication system and connected to the Grand Chamber. Within moments, the leadership of the Confederation had gathered, their forms glowing with desperate hope. We have received a response, she announced. The humans have agreed to help us. The chamber fell silent. Then Velok spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. High Resonator, the human fleet consists of fewer than 300 ships. The Ravager horde numbers in the thousands. This is not military assistance. This is suicide. Kythera's form brightened with something that might have been hope or might have been madness. Perhaps. But they answered our call when no one else would. In the old harmonies there are songs about honor, about species who choose to stand against darkness even when victory seems impossible. I had thought such beings were legends. She turned to face the assembled leadership, her crystalline body ringing with newfound determination. Send a response to the humans. Tell them we accept their offer. Provide them with our complete tactical data about the Ravager horde, and pray to whatever gods watch over small species that these humans are more than they appear to be. Outside the crystal walls, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the approaching storm. But somewhere among those distant points of light, a small blue world was preparing for war. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, reading the Zephirian distress call for the 5th time. The translation software had done its best with the alien harmonics, but the desperation needed no interpretation. She had seen messages like this before, in the dark chapters of human history when entire peoples cried out for help that never came. Admiral, the Galactic Council is requesting immediate communication, reported Lieutenant Commander Torres from the communication station. They're classifying it as urgent diplomatic priority. Chen sighed. She knew what this would be about. Put them through, Commander. The main screen flickered to life, showing the familiar chamber of the Galactic Council. Ambassador Thex of the Altarian Empire appeared first. His forearms gesturing in what humans had learned was a sign of extreme agitation among his species. Admiral Chen, we understand that your government is considering military intervention in the Zephirian situation. We must strongly advise against this course of action. Chen kept her expression neutral. Ambassador Thex, we appreciate your concern. May I ask what specific objections you have to our response to a legitimate distress call? The Ravager horde has never been successfully resisted by conventional military force, interjected Counselor Vex of the Centauri Federation, her crystalline features shifting through worried colors. They have conquered 47 star systems using overwhelming numerical superiority. Your fleet, while admirable for a developing species, simply lacks the capability to meaningfully oppose them. Furthermore, added Ambassador Kren of the Corvan Trade Alliance. Military intervention would likely provoke the Horde into expanding their operations beyond Zephirian space. Your actions could destabilize the entire sector. Chen listened patiently as one after another. The great powers of the galaxy explained why humanity should not involve itself in what they politely termed affairs beyond their current capabilities. They spoke of diplomatic solutions, of refugee programs, of the tragic but inevitable nature of galactic politics. What they did not speak of was justice. Distinguished ambassadors, Chen said when they had finished, I appreciate your counsel. However, the Terran Federation has made its decision. We will be providing military assistance to the Zephirian Confederation. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Ambassador Thek spoke, his voice carrying something between pity and condescension. Admiral, please understand that we speak from centuries of experience in galactic affairs. The human species has much to contribute to our community. But military intervention against a force like the Ravager Horde is simply beyond your current capabilities. You would be throwing away your entire fleet for no strategic gain. Chen's expression hardened. Ambassador, 30 years ago when humanity first made contact with galactic civilization, we learned something important about the universe. We learned that it contained wonders beyond our imagination, species whose wisdom spanned millennia, technologies that seemed like magic to our primitive minds. She paused, looking directly at each ambassador in turn. We also learned that for all your wisdom and technology, you had forgotten something that humanity has never been able to forget. Sometimes the choice is not between victory and defeat. Sometimes the choice is between standing up to evil and looking the other way. We choose to stand. The communication ended with a mixture of disbelief and frustration from the assembled diplomats. Chen turned away from the screen and began issuing orders. Commander Torres, signal all ships in the task force. We depart for Zephirian space in 6 hours. All personnel are to be briefed on the tactical situation. Yes, Admiral. What about the Galactic Council's warnings? Chen's smile was cold as winter starlight. The Council is right about one thing, Commander. This fight is beyond our current capabilities, which is why we're not going to fight it like a traditional fleet engagement. 3 hours later, Chen stood in the briefing room addressing the senior officers of humanity's Third Fleet. The assembled captains, Marines, and tactical specialists listened intently as she outlined what they were up against. The Ravager Horde operates on principles that most galactic civilizations find morally repugnant, she began. They target civilian populations deliberately, use captured populations as living shields, and have no concept of proportional response. They exist in a state of total war. Captain Maria Santos of the assault carrier Fury raised her hand. Admiral, if they're that ruthless, how do we fight them with conventional tactics? We don't, Chen replied. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not going to fight the Ravager Horde the way the Altarians or Centaurians would fight them. We are going to fight them the way humans fight when everything we care about is at stake. The room fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. These were officers who had studied military history, who knew what humanity was capable of when pushed to the brink. The Ravagers have succeeded for so long because they face civilizations that fight with restraint. Chen continued. Species that worry about proportional response, that try to minimize casualties, that seek diplomatic solutions even when facing an enemy that recognizes no diplomacy except strength. She activated the tactical display, showing the Ravager fleet composition and battle patterns. They have never faced a species that still maintains armies designed to fight other humans. They have never faced a military doctrine based on the assumption that your enemy will show no mercy, take no prisoners, and target everything you hold dear. Colonel James Wright of the Marine Corps leaned forward. Admiral, are you authorizing total war protocols? Chen met his gaze steadily. Colonel, the Ravagers have already declared total war. They declared it the moment they decided to exterminate an entire peaceful civilization. We are simply going to respond in kind. She turned to address the entire room. In 12 hours we will arrive in Zephirian space. The enemy will outnumber us 7 to 1. They will have larger ships, more firepower, and hundreds of years of combat experience. By every conventional measure, we cannot win this fight. The Admiral's voice grew quieter but somehow more intense. However, there is something the enemy does not know about humanity. There is something that every analysis of our species has missed. We are the descendants of a world where everything evolved to kill everything else. We are the children of ice ages and plagues, of wars that lasted generations and empires built on the bones of the fallen. She paused, looking at each officer in turn. More importantly, we are the only species in this galaxy that has looked into the abyss of our own nature and chose to be better. We chose peace not because we feared war, but because we understood its true cost. And that choice, that conscious decision to be peaceful, comes with a responsibility. Captain Santos spoke the words that everyone in the room was thinking. When someone threatens the innocent, we stop being peaceful. Exactly, Chen confirmed. The Ravagers think they understand warfare because they have conquered civilizations that fight with honor, with restraint, with hope for diplomatic resolution. They are about to learn what happens when they face a species that fights with love. The briefing continued for another hour, covering tactical deployments, communication protocols, and emergency procedures. But the real message had been delivered in those first few minutes. Humanity was going to war, and they were going to fight it with everything they had learned about survival on a world that had tried to kill them for millions of years. As the officers filed out to prepare their commands, Chen remained behind staring at the tactical display. Tomorrow, the Third Fleet would arrive in Zephirian space. Tomorrow, the galaxy would learn why humanity had conquered Earth before they ever left it. Tomorrow, the Ravager horde would discover that there was something worse than facing an enemy with superior technology. They would face an enemy with superior motivation. The first Ravager ships dropped out of hyperspace like a plague of mechanical locusts. They emerged in the outer system of Zephyros Prime in perfect formation, their biomechanical hulls gleaming with an oily sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Each vessel was a fusion of living tissue and cybernetic enhancement, grown rather than built, designed for one purpose: consumption. High Resonator Kithra watched from the command center as the enemy fleet took position. The tactical displays showed the horrible truth in stark detail. Over 2,000 ships, ranging from fighter-sized scavengers to massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything in the Zephirian defense fleet. They are not approaching directly, observed Second Resonator Velox, his crystalline form flickering with nervous energy. They are establishing a perimeter around the system. Kithra studied the enemy movements with growing dread.
They are not in a hurry.
They know we cannot escape, cannot fight. They are savoring the moment before they feed. The Ravager horde had perfected their tactics over centuries of conquest. They surrounded their target, eliminated any possibility of escape, then began systematic harvesting. Military targets died first, then industrial centers, then population centers. The process was designed to maximize both resource extraction and psychological terror. But something was wrong with this attack. The Ravagers had positioned themselves perfectly to begin their usual methodical destruction, but they were hesitating. Long-range sensors detected unusual communication patterns among the enemy fleet, intense data exchanges that suggested confusion or disagreement. Then the first attack began, and Kithara understood why they had delayed. The Ravager assault was unlike anything in their recorded tactical history. Instead of their usual overwhelming frontal assault, they launched precise strikes against specific targets, communication relays, sensor arrays, and defensive installations. But they avoided population centers entirely, and their weapons seemed calibrated to disable rather than destroy. They are hurting us, Velox realized with growing horror. They know the humans are coming. The truth hit the Zephirian leadership like a physical blow. The Ravager horde, masters of total warfare, had adapted their tactics to account for the approaching human fleet. They were using the Zephirian population as bait, positioning them as living shields against any rescue attempt. As if to confirm this terrifying realization, a transmission arrived from the lead Ravager vessel. The voice that emerged from the speakers was a horrific fusion of organic speech and mechanical modulation, like a chorus of dying minds speaking in unison. Crystalline beings of these worlds, your distress call was intercepted. We know of the approaching rescue fleet. We offer you simple terms. Surrender now, and your harvesting will be swift. Resist, and we will ensure that your would-be rescuers arrive in time to watch your final moments. The transmission ended, leaving the command center in stunned silence. The Ravagers had turned their desperate plea for help into a weapon against both the Zephirians and their rescuers. High Resonator, Velox whispered. Perhaps we should recall the human fleet. We cannot ask them to walk into such a trap. Kithara's response was immediate and absolute. No, signal all our remaining defense forces. If the Ravagers want to use us as bait, we will make sure that bait has teeth. The next 6 hours were a nightmare of desperate preparation. Zephirian civilian ships were hastily armed with mining lasers and industrial equipment. Scientists and artists found themselves learning to operate weapons they had never imagined they would need. Children were evacuated to the deepest crystal caverns while their parents took positions in improvised defensive lines. The Ravagers made no move to stop these preparations. They simply waited, confident that their numerical superiority and tactical position made the outcome inevitable. Then, space twisted, and the human fleet arrived. The distortion signatures appeared at the edge of the system without warning. No grand announcement, no demands for surrender, no attempt at communication with the enemy. The human ships simply materialized from hyperspace and immediately opened fire. What followed was unlike any space battle in recorded galactic history. The humans had studied every available record of Ravager tactics, and they had designed their response accordingly. Instead of engaging in the traditional long-range artillery duel that most species preferred, the human fleet charged straight into close combat range, accepting horrific casualties to get inside the enemy formation. Admiral Chen watched from the bridge of the Defiance as her ships carved through the Ravager perimeter like a blade through flesh. Human vessels, smaller and seemingly outgunned, revealed weapons that had been specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in biomechanical armor. Target their nerve clusters, she ordered calmly as her ship shuddered under enemy fire. All ships focus fire on the organic components. Ignore the armor, kill the nervous system. Captain Santos, commanding the assault carrier Fury, launched wave after wave of fighters and marine assault craft directly at the largest Ravager vessels. These were not precision strikes against military targets. These were boarding actions designed to capture and hold enemy ships from the inside. "Admiral," reported Commander Torres, "the enemy is attempting to reposition to threaten the Zephirian population centers." Chen's response was immediate. "All vessels execute Protocol 7. No Ravager ship approaches the inner system." Protocol 7 was a human military doctrine that had never been used in galactic warfare. It was a tactical approach that prioritized mission objectives over survival, that accepted the destruction of friendly forces to prevent enemy success. It was the military application of a simple human principle. Some things were worth dying for. The human fleet formed a defensive wall between the Ravagers and the populated worlds, trading their ships' lives for time and position. But they were not simply sacrificing themselves. Each human vessel that died took multiple enemy ships with it, using ramming attacks, self-destruct sequences, and weapons that other species considered barbarically direct. Colonel Wright led Marine boarding parties onto captured Ravager vessels, fighting room by room through corridors designed for beings twice human size. His soldiers used weapons that most galactic civilizations had banned as unnecessarily cruel. Explosives that created chain reactions in organic tissue, chemical agents that disrupted cybernetic interfaces, and most terrifying of all, close combat tactics that treated every engagement as a fight to the death. The Ravagers, accustomed to enemies who fought with restraint and sought to minimize casualties, found themselves facing an opponent who seemed to care nothing for their own losses. Human pilots flew suicide missions with the same calm professionalism that other species reserved for routine patrols. Human Marines charged into certain death if it meant denying the enemy a single strategic objective, but it was not suicidal madness that drove them. It was something far more dangerous, calculated ferocity guided by tactical brilliance. As the battle raged, Kithara watched in amazement as the impossible began to happen. The Ravager formation, which should have crushed the smaller human fleet through sheer weight of numbers, began to fragment. Ships that had never retreated in centuries of conquest started pulling back from the human assault. "They are afraid," Velox observed with wonder. "How is that possible?" Kithara understood what her second was seeing. The Ravagers were not retreating because they were losing. They were retreating because they were facing something they had never encountered before. An enemy that fought with love instead of hunger, that chose sacrifice over survival, that turned their own mortality into a weapon. The humans were teaching the galaxy's most feared predators what it meant to face prey that refused to be consumed, and the lesson was written in fire and blood across the space between the stars. The battle for the Zephirian system had been raging for 18 hours when the tide began to turn. What had started as a desperate defense had evolved into something the galaxy had not seen in living memory: a successful offensive against the Ravager horde. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of the Defiance, her uniform torn and bloodstained from a hull breach that had claimed half her senior staff. Around her, the surviving crew worked with the mechanical precision of soldiers who had accepted that they might not live to see tomorrow, but were determined to make their deaths count. "Status report," she ordered, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. 60% of our fleet is destroyed or disabled," reported the acting tactical officer, a young ensign who had been promoted 3 times during the battle as his superiors died at their posts. "But we've eliminated over 40% of the Ravager force. They're pulling back to the outer system." Chen nodded grimly. By any conventional military analysis, the human fleet had achieved the impossible. They had not only survived contact with the Ravager horde, they had inflicted casualties that should have been beyond their capability. But conventional analysis did not account for what humans were willing to sacrifice when they fought for others. "Admiral," came the voice of Captain Santos over the communication system, "we've successfully captured 3 Ravager dreadnoughts. My Marines are reporting some very interesting intelligence from their organic computers." Chen's bloodshot eyes focused with sudden intensity. "What kind of intelligence, Captain?" "The kind that explains why they've never been beaten before, and why they're scared of us now." 20 minutes later, Chen was aboard Santos's assault carrier, standing in what had once been the command center of a Ravager bioship. The organic walls pulsed with dying nerve impulses, and the air stank of biochemicals and burnt electronics. Marine teams had secured the vessel at horrific cost, but what they had discovered made every death worthwhile. Santos led her to a cluster of organic terminals that her technical specialists had managed to interface with human systems. "Admiral, this is their tactical database. Every engagement they've fought for the past 3 centuries." Chen studied the data streams flowing across the screens. What she saw confirmed her darkest suspicions about their enemy, but also revealed something unexpected: vulnerability. They fight the same battle every time, she realized. Overwhelming force, systematic harvesting, psychological terror. They've never adapted because they've never needed to. "That's not the interesting part," Santos said grimly. "Look at this." The display shifted to show communication intercepts from the Ravager fleet. The mechanical voices spoke in their hybrid language of organic thought and digital precision. But the translation software made their meaning clear. They were afraid, not the tactical caution of a military force facing unexpected resistance, but genuine existential terror. The Ravagers, who had spent centuries as the galaxy's apex predators, were encountering something that challenged their fundamental understanding of warfare. "They keep talking about death lovers and sacrifice makers," Santos explained. "They can't understand why we're willing to die for beings we've never met. It goes against everything in their programming." Chen felt a cold smile spread across her face. "They're used to fighting species that want to live. They don't know how to handle an enemy that's willing to die." The implications were staggering. The Ravager horde had conquered 47 star systems using the same basic strategy. Overwhelming force combined with the assumption that their enemies valued self-preservation above all else. They had never faced a species that would sacrifice everything for principle. "Captain, how many boarding teams do we have left?" Santos checked her datapad. 400 Marines spread across 6 assault ships. "We've lost over 60% of our assault capacity." "It's enough," Chen said with grim satisfaction. "Signal all ships. We're going to teach these monsters what humans do to bullies." The next phase of the battle began with a maneuver that violated every principle of conventional space warfare. Instead of consolidating their defensive position, the human fleet launched a coordinated assault on the largest Ravager vessels. They ignored the smaller ships entirely, focusing their remaining strength on the enemy command structure. Colonel Wright led the most audacious assault personally, taking his remaining Marines aboard, captured Ravager fighters to attack the Horde's flagship. The biomechanical vessel was larger than most human space stations, but size meant nothing to soldiers who had been born on a world where everything was designed to kill them. The fighting inside the Ravager ships was brutal beyond description. Human Marines battled through corridors filled with organic traps, automated defenses and cybernetic horrors that had been designed to terrify any opponent into submission. But terror was just another tactical challenge to soldiers who had grown up reading about the Holocaust, the killing fields, and every other atrocity their species had inflicted on itself. Wright's team fought with methodical precision, using explosives to collapse nerve clusters, chemical weapons to disrupt organic systems, and close-quarters combat techniques that turned every engagement into a lesson about human lethality. They did not fight like civilized beings seeking military victory. They fought like angry gods seeking justice. "Colonel," came the voice of Sergeant Major Rodriguez over the squad communication system, "we've reached what looks like their main computational center. It's unusual." Wright arrived to find his soldiers standing before a chamber filled with what appeared to be living brains suspended in cybernetic matrices. The organic computers that guided the Ravager horde were not artificial intelligences, but the preserved minds of conquered species, forced into eternal servitude. "My God," whispered Corporal Chen, the youngest member of the squad. "They're prisoners. All of them." Wright felt something cold and terrible settle in his chest as he realized what they were looking at. The Ravager horde did not simply kill their enemies. They enslaved them, turning their minds into components of the very weapons used to destroy their people. "New mission parameters," he announced to his team. "We're not just capturing the ship. We're liberating it." What followed was less a military operation than an act of furious compassion. Human Marines worked frantically to disconnect the enslaved minds from their cybernetic prisons, while combat engineers rigged the ship's organic components with enough explosives to ensure that the Ravager collective would never reclaim their prizes. Similar scenes played out across a dozen captured vessels as human forces discovered the true nature of their enemy. The Ravager horde was not just a conquering army. It was a parasitic cancer that had been growing through the galaxy for centuries, fed by the suffering of every species they had encountered. The liberation of the enslaved minds triggered a cascade failure throughout the Ravager fleet. Ships that had fought with mechanical precision suddenly began operating erratically as their organic computers died or were freed. The horde's tactical coordination, which had been their greatest strength, collapsed into chaos. Admiral Chen watched from the bridge of the Defiance as the enemy formation disintegrated. Ravager ships that had never retreated in their recorded history began fleeing toward the edge of the system. But humanity was not done with them. "All ships pursue and destroy," she ordered. "No ship of the horde leaves this system intact." "Admiral," protested her acting executive officer, "our casualties are already beyond acceptable levels." "If we pursue them into open space," Chen's expression was carved from stone. "Commander, these monsters have been feeding on innocent civilizations for centuries. Today that ends. Today we make sure they never hurt anyone again." The human fleet, reduced to barely 60 operational ships, began the systematic destruction of a fleeing enemy force that still outnumbered them 3-1. It should have been impossible. It should have been suicide. But impossible and suicidal were concepts that had lost all meaning the moment humanity decided that some things were worth dying for. In the crystalline cities below, the Zephirians watched in amazement as their rescuers turned the tide of a battle that should have ended in certain defeat. They did not yet understand what they were witnessing: the birth of a legend that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of warfare. They were watching humans fight not for conquest or glory, but for love, and love, they were learning, was the most dangerous force in the universe. The last Ravager command ship died 3 days later in the outer reaches of the Kepler sector, its biomechanical hull cracking apart under sustained fire from the human destroyer Retribution. Admiral Chen watched the final explosion from the bridge of her damaged flagship, feeling no satisfaction in the victory, only grim completion of a necessary task. "That's the last of them, Admiral," reported Commander Torres, who had somehow survived the entire battle despite serving on the bridge of the most targeted ship in the fleet. "Long-range sensors confirm no Ravager vessels remain in the sector." Chen nodded slowly. Around her, the bridge crew worked with the quiet efficiency of people who had seen too much death and destruction to celebrate. The battle for Zephirian space was over, but the cost had been staggering. Of the 280 ships that had arrived with the Third Fleet, only 43 remained operational. Over 15,000 human men and women had died in the space of 4 days, but they had won. More than that, they had done something the galaxy had thought impossible. They had not just defeated the Ravager horde, they had eliminated it entirely. "Signal the fleet," Chen ordered. "All ships return to Zephyros Prime, and send a message to the Galactic Council. Tell them the Ravager threat has been neutralized." The trip back to the inner system gave Chen time to process what they had accomplished. The pursuit of the fleeing Ravagers had been methodical and merciless. Human forces had tracked down every ship, every station, every hidden base that had supported the Horde's operations. They had interrogated captured mines, followed supply lines, and systematically dismantled an empire of terror that had taken centuries to build. It had not been a battle. It had been an extermination. Other species would have stopped at victory, content to drive the enemy away and claim success. But humans had learned long ago that evil driven away was evil that would return. So they had followed the Ravagers to every hiding place, destroyed every ship, and ensured that the galactic cancer would never spread again. The reaction from the Galactic Council had been immediate and profound. Emergency sessions were called. Military analysts demanded detailed reports. Diplomatic protocols were hastily rewritten as the galaxy's great powers suddenly found themselves forced to reassess everything they thought they knew about the small blue world on the rim. But Chen was not thinking about galactic politics as her fleet limped back towards Zephirian space. She was thinking about the faces of the enslaved minds they had liberated, the crystalline cities they had saved, and the terrible knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, other predators were watching and learning. High Resonator Cathara was waiting for them when they arrived at Zephyros Prime. The crystalline being stood in the great plaza of the capital city, surrounded by millions of her people, who had gathered to witness the return of their unlikely saviors. The harmonic songs that filled the air were unlike anything in Zephirian history. Melodies of gratitude so pure and profound that they seemed to make the very air shimmer with emotion. Chen accepted the invitation to visit the surface. Though she insisted on keeping the meeting small, she had no desire for grand ceremonies or public displays. The 40 surviving captains of her fleet accompanied her, along with Colonel Wright and the remnants of the Marine Assault Forces. The Zephirians had prepared a massive celebration, but Chen's first words put an end to any thoughts of festivity. "High Resonator, we need to talk, privately." They met in Cathara's personal chambers, where the crystal walls provided perfect acoustic isolation. The surviving human officers sat in chairs that had been hastily resized for their alien guests, while Cathara's form flickered through a spectrum of colors that indicated deep emotional complexity. "Admiral Chen," Cathara began, "our people wish to honor you and your fleet. The quantum crystals we promised, our harmonic libraries, our research data, everything we have is yours." Chen shook her head. "We didn't come here for payment, High Resonator. We came because it was the right thing to do. But there's something you need to understand about what happened here." She activated a portable display unit and brought up the tactical recordings from the battle. The Ravager horde had conquered 47 star systems before they came here. They had enslaved millions of sentient beings and turned them into components of their war machine. They represented a threat to every peaceful civilization in this galaxy. Kithara's form brightened with curiosity. "But you destroyed them. The threat is ended." "This threat is ended," Chen corrected. "But the conditions that allowed it to exist are still in place. For centuries, the great powers of this galaxy watched the Ravagers grow stronger and did nothing. They knew what was happening to the conquered worlds, knew about the enslaved minds, knew that eventually the horde would come for them too, but they chose to look away because intervention was expensive and dangerous." Colonel Wright leaned forward, his battle-scarred face grim. "High Resonator, we found records in the captured ships. The Ravagers had been planning to attack Altarian space within 5 years. The Centauri Federation was next on their list after that. Every civilization that refused to help you was on their target schedule. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The galaxy's great powers had not just abandoned the Zephirians to their fate, they had abandoned themselves, gambling that someone else would solve the problem before it reached their borders. "What will you do now?" Cathara asked quietly. Chen stood and walked to the crystal wall, looking out at the stars that had witnessed so much death and destruction. "We're going home, High Resonator. But before we go, we're going to make sure the galaxy understands what happened here." The message that Admiral Chen transmitted to the Galactic Council was brief and direct. broadcast on all major communication channels so that every civilization would hear it clearly. This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Federation 3rd Fleet. 4 days ago, the Ravager Horde was completely eliminated from this galaxy. Their ships are destroyed, their bases are burned, and their threat is ended forever. She paused, allowing the magnitude of that statement to sink in. The Ravagers were allowed to grow into a galactic threat because the civilizations with the power to stop them chose not to act. For centuries, they stood by while entire species were enslaved and destroyed, hoping that someone else would solve the problem. The Admiral's voice grew colder, carrying the weight of 15,000 graves. Humanity solved the problem, but we want to be very clear about something. The next time a call for aid goes out from innocent people facing extinction, we will hear it. We will respond. And if we arrive to find that the galaxy's great powers have once again chosen to look the other way while evil flourishes, we will remember. Chen's final words carried a promise that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. The universe is vast and full of predators, but it also contains species that choose to stand against the darkness. Earth remembers every civilization that preys upon the innocent. And Earth remembers every civilization that turns away when help is needed. Choose your next actions carefully, because we will be watching. The transmission ended, but its effects rippled across the galaxy like a shockwave. Emergency council sessions were called. Military budgets were revised upward. Trade agreements began, including clauses about mutual defense and humanitarian intervention. The great powers had suddenly realized that their comfortable isolation was an illusion. Somewhere on the galaxy's rim, a species of apex predators had chosen to be guardians instead of conquerors, and they had just demonstrated that they possessed both the capability and the will to enforce their own sense of justice. As the human fleet prepared to depart Zephirian space, Kythera sent one final message to Admiral Chen. Thank you for showing us that the universe contains more than just predators and prey. Thank you for proving that some beings will fight for strangers, that some species will sacrifice everything for principle, that love is stronger than hunger. Chen's response was simple. High Resonator, the galaxy is full of civilizations that have forgotten what they stand for. Humanity never made that mistake. We know exactly who we are and what we're willing to die for. The next time evil raises its head in this galaxy, it will find us waiting. The human fleet departed for Earth, leaving behind a changed galaxy and a new understanding of what it meant to be the guardians of the innocent. Behind them, in the crystal cities of Zephyros Prime, a new song began to spread from world to world. It was a harmony of hope, carried on frequencies that reached across the stars, telling every peaceful civilization that they were no longer alone. Somewhere in the darkness, humanity was watching, and humanity remembered everything.